Hi everyone, I'm here to bring you a classic and somewhat competitive matchup of Gabriel Santiago versus HB Engineering the Future. Yeah, it's very vanilla, both core IDs using core set cards that are very powerful. Now, before I delve into this game, I just want to mention that, as I always say, now is a very good time to be a netrunner. There are lots and lots of independent content creators popping up left, right, and center. There are lots of new people who are making videos and podcasts, lots of new podcasts springing up to join in some of the older ranks of the older ones, such as Randa's Click. And it's there that I found a gem of a video, or podcast, sorry, where the crew interview Timmy Wong after his very stunning performance at Worlds. And if I'm not wrong, that was the podcast where he mentions that Gabe is actually pretty well positioned right now. A very aggressive criminal to handle the two strong decks at the moment, which is uh, food codes and astrobiotics. So this is my attempt at making a competitive Gabe deck. It is based on the Parasite Files Gabe deck that is floating around. You can find a couple of examples on Netrunner DB, but I'll leave you to do that. Right now, let's get into the game. This here is a somewhat okay opening hand that I believe I keep because it contains Drug Dealer, which allows me to draw the rest of my deck. It's basically like a mini wild side, so you don't say no to it. My opponent starts by obviously icing up HQ. So since I have a Data Sucker in my hand, I go for the R&D run instead. And then I draw into a Cow Siphon, which I cannot use because there's an ice on HQ. Following that, I install a Drug Dealer. So that's a pretty solid start. You get a Data Sucker going, which is your impetus to run, and you have a Drug Dealer that's drawing you more cards. Now, my opponent installs an ice on the remote here. You can probably suspect that's a Turing, otherwise it would probably go on Archives instead. So, it is very tempting to install Bank Job right here and go for the Bank Job, but knowing there's a Turing, he probably will res it. I'm not going to waste my time. I'm just going to solidify my board state, draw a couple of cards, and hope to find some breakers to get through HQ. Not much in the way of breakers, except for the breach, and I don't think I really need breach at this point. So I just continue drawing, I believe. And at this point, I was starting to panic a bit. I could drive by the remote, sure, but I'm running low on credits. I need something to gain credits right now. And the only money card I can see in my hand is Account Siphon. So I decided to breach and go for the Account Siphon. With 2 clicks left, I can click through any Bioroid Ice. If it's an Architect, it can fire. If it's an Ichi, I can click through it. If it's a wall static, I can break it. But it's not a barrier. It's an assassin. That is probably the worst possible ice I could hit. Even if it's an Enigma, losing my Siphon is fine. The worst is Assassin because I lose 3 cards from my hand. I lose my Breach, the one that I just installed for 2 credits. I lose 2 credits a click and my only Fractor, and I don't even get a Siphon. I don't get a Siphon because he spent all his money on the Assassin Trace. That's the beauty of a Tracer Ice on HQ. If the opponent doesn't break it, you get to dump all your credits into Assassin. Sure, it wasted 12 of his credits, but I don't get rich. I'm poor too. All I get is 2 credits from Gabe's ability, a Data Sucker token, and an access that is not an agenda. I'm pretty far behind already. And he can slowly chug away, gaining credits because he is efficient. He is HB Engineering the Future. So I draw into my emergency shutdown, which is perfect timing, except that I can't get into HQ again. I need an inside job. If I find an inside job, I'm for sure going to exploit emergency shutdown on the assassin, that hard res assassin. Losing 7 credits as a corp is pretty painful, and I want to try to get that shutdown off. Now I do manage to get a bank job off because he was too poor to defend the remote. This is very important because that bank job is going to give me all the credits I need to do everything I want for the early game. Now my main priority here is to get an emergency shutdown off. I cannot run into the assassin without any breakers because he'll simply fire the net damage and snipe off my emergency shutdown, so that cannot do. Instead I go for the inside job, which is credit neutral. In fact, it gives me 1 Data Sucker counter. It's credit neutral because Gabe's ability fires, neutralizing the inside job cost, and I get to shut down his assassin and gain a Vitruvius at the same time. That's pretty efficient. That was a very good turn for me. So this basically forced him to re-ice HQ to prevent me from doing something like that again. So HQ vulnerability is always a problem against Gabe. And now I poke the remote, forcing him to res the Turing there to stop me from trashing the Eve. I cannot afford to let him gain money. Once HB gets out of control with their econ assets, I'm in big trouble. Forcing the Turing res might be a wrong move though. We'll see later on if that's the case. But now that I'm not happy with the Turing, I decide to parasite it down. Truth be told, the Turing actually isn't that big of a problem because I do have a York in hand. It's definitely an option to just install York and pay 2 sucker counters each run. But at this point, I cannot actually afford to install the York and trash the Eve. So this is why the motivation for the parasite. Hopefully I can destroy one of his Turings, but no. Instead, the Architect comes into play, and because I haven't found a ferry yet, I'm forced to let it fire. So this could be a problem. Now he's going to install something from R&D and something from HQ or Archives. I will get to kill his Turing, thankfully, but that comes at a huge cost. Letting the Caught Fire Architect is always a sure step to doom. And that's probably a Jackson you see in the remote there, because as the Corp, I trust that James, who is my opponent, will probably know better than to let me get a free bank job off. So here I do get into the server. I cannot afford to trash the Eve, but I do have 2 credits, so I'm going to trash the Breaker Bay Grid while I still can. If I don't trash it now, he's just going to throw an Ash, a Caprice, and another econ asset in there to make things worse. I don't want to give him that easy econ, so for 2 credits, the Breaker Bay Grid is definitely worth trashing. And as you see there, that is indeed a Jackson. My opponent wise enough not to give me a free bank job or security testing server. So, over to me, I get to security test. I security test Archives and poke around to see if I can get a free security testing. I cannot. It's an Ichi there. Do I click through the Ichi or do I lose the sucker? Pretty tricky question right here. The sucker is actually really important. But looking at my board state right now, I have no breakers. I have a Faust in hand, which doesn't really need sucker support. The parasite in my hand is pretty painful. I'd rather have the sucker, but at this point I realize that I don't think I can get any free access into servers from now on. It's going to be very difficult to run through servers from now on to accumulate sucker counters because the centrals are all well and truly locked up. So I decided to just screw it and go for the sec testing instead. And here I made a big mistake. I installed Faust. This is a big mistake. Can anyone see why? Can you think of a reason why? You can pause the video to find out. Well, it is bad because I desperately need security testing money. I'm on 0 credits, and now Archives is a free security testing ground for me. Not really. I still need to click through the trace or spend 1 credit on the trace, but I can security test on Archives because the trash program subroutines mean nothing to me. I should be doing that. Instead, I installed a Faust, which means that now I cannot security test on Archives. And I slammed into a wall of static on the remote, which means I can't security test there either. So that was a big mistake. I installed the Faust to get rid of cards from my hand, because looking at my hand, you see that there's nothing I want to throw away. But it's a big mistake. I really should not have installed the Faust. I should be taking advantage of the fact that his Archives are empty, get 3 credits from there every turn at the cost of 2 clicks, and force him to re-ice Archives. Slow him down. That's what playing games is all about. Placing central pressure and forcing the Corp to ice their centrals before their remotes, which means they can't score agendas. And rightfully so. Look at him. He has no agendas to his name yet. He has to contend with things like Inside Job on HQ, which leads obviously into me being on credit neutral ground and him losing credits via emergency shutdown. So I access 1 card, I gain 1 sucker counter, and he loses 5 credits for the Ichi. Pretty good trade. He's only on 8 credits, even though I'm letting him get an Eve tick down. You notice that I've allowed him to get his Eve, but his spot state is not all that set up yet. He has barely enough credits to res ice. He only has 2 res ice at this point. My parasite and emergency shutdown denials are coming to big play right here. Unfortunately, now he has 5 credits ticking down per turn with the 2 campaigns there, and I can't really do anything about it because I'm dirt poor. What do I do here? I draw into a ferry, and this is pretty important. The ferry is my golden ticket through an Ichi, an assassin, you name it, I can get through it. So, what is the best server to attack at this point? I'm thinking very hard right here. I know that ferry and into sneak door is probably the best line of play here, but I just don't have enough money to do that. Maybe it's time to click for credits, install the ferry, and go for a sneak door next turn. That seems like a reasonable plan until I draw my mimic. Now I have even more options. Oh, how I wish I had my sucker at this point. So here I force him to use his Jackson. It's always good to force Jackson users, and most courts will simply let you trash them. But with Gabe, you have to sack your Jackson because you don't want me to get 3 credits from security testing. So forcing his Jacksons out is always good. This means that yeah, he cannot do things like firing ABTs off. He cannot he cannot really reduce agenda density in HQ by chucking agendas in archives. So getting rid of Jackson is always a good thing, especially when the corp is doing it for you. So now that I have my Mimic, I can pretty safely run on Architects, but I still need to worry about bigger ice. I do have fairies in my hand. I'm still not installing them. Instead, I go for the bank job on the Wall of Static remote because at this point I'm really desperate for cash. And that's exactly what I get, lots of cash. Had to use my files to chuck a sneak door beta into the bin to get the cash, but I think it's fine. You could argue that I should have installed the sneak door and run instead, but he would simply rest the Ichi at this point. Now he's dirt rich, no longer dirt poor, and I can't get through Ichi easily. So that's out of the question. He's on 20 credits. It was just a moment ago that I said his bot state wasn't so good, but you see the magic of getting 5 credits every turn. It adds up so quickly. This is why HB is so strong. Which other corp can gain 5 credits a turn for no clicks? That's insane. Well, at least I have a couple of credits now with bank job, but he is setting up for a scoring remote. At this point, things look pretty bleak. I'm not gonna lie. My board state is barely set up. I don't have my barrier breaker out yet, and installing York cost me 5 credits. I bump into an Enigma which cost me a click. I'm still gonna break the second subroutine because I do want to make a successful run. I think that's for the security test. Yep, that's for the security test. I desperately wanted the money, but now I know that it's a good time to install York and run R&D for the actual access, seeing an Ichi 1.0 off the top. Still, my board state is not very good, and my opponent is simply going to install that newfound Ichi right on R&D, locking it up for me. So, Gabe really needs to get about 4 or 5 points by the time mid-game rolls around, otherwise Gabe will just suffocate, as I am right now. I'm barely keeping afloat on credits. I'm back down to 6 credits after installing that York, and now he's starting to churn out agendas. He has stabilized very well. He's on 23 credits. I'm only on 6. How am I supposed to contest that Ash Caprice server? It's not going to happen. Make no mistake about that. So, I security test the remote, and I start drawing for solutions. What kind of solutions are there in my deck? What do you think I need to get past this suffocation? Because right now I can't afford to run any of his servers at all. Here I do make a run on the final server to get... Yep, I was security testing there, and with John Masnori I was able to get a card draw out of that. So Faust is pretty good. Faust allows me to cycle through my deck and gain credits at the same time. Faust is actually a pretty good card in game, and it really synergizes with Drug Dealer as well, because oftentimes I'm pretty poor, as I am right now. So, what is my solution? It's in my hand right now. It's called Account Siphon. I'm going for it. I don't think he can stop me right here. I can either click through everything or ditch my entire hand to Faust. And that I definitely will, because there are 4 useless cards in my hand. I no longer need my Special Orders, nor my Desperado, nor the Plus Creep. Notoriety is still pretty important though. We'll see if that comes into play. But here, I'm going to make a successful Siphon. There's an Eli, and I consider whether to click through it or to break it with my Faust. It's a pretty tough choice. If I break it with Faust, I might leave myself vulnerable to the next piece of ice, especially if it's another Eli. Or worse still, a Wall of Static. I don't have enough sucker counters to suck it down to 2, so I'm forced to spend 3 cards here to break the Eli. Why did I not click through the Eli? You'll see in a second, but I think you might have a good idea why. The next ice is Assassin, which is easily broken with the Fairy. And I make a successful run, drawing into another Account Siphon with John Masnori. And here, you might see my grand scheme of things. In the grand scheme of things, my plan coming true. I'm now going to make a run on Archives. And it looks pretty innocuous, so he lets me through. Then I make a run on R&D. Now, it's probably too late to stop me. He can still res an ice, but he chooses not to because he's only on 7 credits. He would rather defend his remote server. He knows if he reses the ice and goes broke, I can easily run the remote and trash his caprice and all that stuff. So he lets me through, and as a result, I score notoriety. Notoriety is amazing. I only need 2 more agendas to win now. That is huge. And it's done on my terms. I do not need to be succumb to the will of random accesses on HQ or R&D. However, I have to worry about my opponent scoring out. He is attempting to make a score on the remote, so I go in for the siphon that I just drew with John Masnori last turn. And this time I'm clicking through the Eli. I cannot afford to spend cards to break it. Technically I could, but I'm not going to. I'll break the assassin with my accumulated sucker tokens. Because he did not res any ice on archives or R&D, I have a lot of sucker tokens to use. That assassin isn't going to do much. And I have all the credits in the world to break assassin with my mimic. And so my last click is going to be server pressure. I haven't touched the server for ages, but now that my opponent is pretty poor, this is the perfect time to strike. There's no point playing against rich HB or playing the remote game against the rich HB decks right now. Food codes is just too powerful for that. Instead, I'm going to use standard criminal trick of account siphon and go in and try to break Caprice Nisei. We play a side game, and I fail. Of course I fail. So, I lose the game, and he stabilizes this by playing hedge fund and double advancing the beta test. He is now in a pretty good spot because not only did he get rid of the agenda that I could steal this turn, more importantly, he played a hedge fund, which means that he can actually afford to defend his remote server now. So what I do here is to place pressure on all servers. First, I go in for R&D, forcing him to rest the Ichi, otherwise I will continue gaining lots of accesses, and I draw into my third sure gamble because Jinteki.net's random generator is complete utter nonsense. Then I make a remote run. Since he rests the Ichi, he's on 4 credits. This is when he's most vulnerable. I'm going in for the kill. I do have to get past the side game though, which I don't. He spends a credit to keep me out. With 2 clicks left, I continue placing pressure. The problem is I can't keep bidding 0 because I know at the back of my mind he has an Adonis taking down. He can afford to just bid 1 every turn and still stabilize. So I'm forced to bid 1 here to win against him. This allows me to make a successful run and burn his entire remote. Notice I'm now at 15 credits. It costs me nearly half my credit stack just to do this. That is a very expensive run because I had to beat the ashtrays as well. When I'm done with it all, I'm back down to 6 credits. Very money hungry deck. And finally, I run archives to get my security testing money. So this is very crippling for my opponent because he no longer has a secure scoring server for his global food initiative that he wants to score. That is very important. He could easily have chucked a food in that remote next turn and easily have won by virtue of side games. So stopping that was huge. But now I need to stabilize. Thankfully, the 3 sure gambles in my hand will help me tide across the rest of the game. I still need to find 2 agendas though. I'm not out of the woods just yet. And I also have to be wary of never advanced shenanigans, which HB is very capable of doing. So after a security test run, where my opponent rests an Ichi to make invalidate my security testing, I swoop in for the kill on the remote, forcing him to use his final Jackson Howard. I thought that was an Ash or a Caprice. That was why I ran it. The best time to get rid of Ash or Caprice in the remote is when the corp is poor, so that he cannot res any of the outer ice on that remote. So I think that was the right play, but it turned out to be a Jackson. Now I go in for R&D. Now that there's no remote to be had, R&D is the best place to go for agendas, and sure enough, I found a global food initiative. Guess what? I'm on match point now, even though I've only stolen 2 agendas, because global food. He found the Chrysium Grid and placed it on HQ, but by now it's too late. Too little too late, because I've already dumped all the siphons I had on him. So now it's just a matter of slamming into R&D repeatedly until I find the winning agenda. It's not cheap. 2 credits per run. And once my opponent stabilizes, he can re-ice R&D to make it harder and harder for me to get in each turn. Remember, I don't have that many sure gambles left in my hand. I can only do this for so long. So I hit R&D again. With 14 cards left in the deck, I make a successful run and steal the final NAPD contract. Apparently, he only had one agenda left in his deck, one or two. The rest were in his hand, so I got pretty lucky there. So there are many comments I can make about this game and about deck choice and everything, but I want to focus on the one probably most outstanding card, which is Notoriety. That ain't jank. Well, not anymore at least. When food codes is all around, everywhere, Notoriety suddenly becomes a very, very appealing card. You only need steal 3 of 9 agendas instead of 4, and every single agenda is worth 2 points, so your Notoriety will always be relevant. The problem with food codes is that the final agenda can be very hard to find. A typical endgame situation is as such when up against food codes. You are both on match point, your opponent as the court is trying to score their final agenda, usually the Global Food Initiative, in a very secure remote. And there are only 3 other agendas left floating around in the game, 2 of which are buried in R&D, and they might be at the bottom of R&D, so you might never ever get to access them. And there might be one agenda in your opponent's HQ, or not. In any case, it's not going to be easy to get into the HQ multiple times. So usually in these scenarios, the only way you're going to get an agenda, unless you have a Maker's Eye or indexing, is to go for the Caprice remote, which gives you a very low win rate. Because you have to win the side game, possibly twice, against an Ash. So in those situations, Notoriety suddenly becomes a very appealing option, because you don't have to leave your game victory to random access or random luck with side games. You just need to run the central servers 3 times to win. And to help you with that, you're playing Criminal, which means that you have access to Inside Job, one of the best cards for getting your Notoriety through. It's unlike Apex, where Apocalypse is pretty hard to pull off because of his vulnerability to so many different types of ice. With Gabe, you can get through everything with Faust and Inside Job for a reasonable price. Moreover, as you saw in this game, what happened during the Notoriety turn was that I was able to snowball out of control during that turn with all my various run events. I was able to siphon through HQ to give me enough money to run the other 2 servers, or rather, siphon such that my opponent had no money to rest ice on the other 2 servers, and I was able to security testing while getting my Notoriety done as well. So it's not a complete waste of time getting my Notoriety. Even I actually gained momentum by executing my Notoriety, because I was able to get a security testing, siphon my opponent, access 1 card from R&D, and gain 1 agenda point. How's that for efficiency? The only question is it actually better than RNDI? I can play either, but not both, due to influence constraints. Notoriety has a couple of benefits which I feel outweigh the benefits of RNDI, at least in the current competitive meta. The surprise factor is not to be underestimated. When an opponent thinks you cannot win when you're on match point because of the low agenda density, you bust out the Notoriety. The bigger surprise is the fact that most corps tend not to place their Caprice Niseis on central servers, instead saving it for the remote. If your opponent doesn't know that you're playing Notoriety, they won't expect that they need to prevent you from successfully running all 3 central servers, and that's something you can exploit. Unlike RNDI, Notoriety is also a guaranteed thing. As long as you see it in your hand, you know that you can for sure get that 1 agenda point. And there's something to be said about agenda point manipulating cards. They are typically very strong. Like Public Support, Quantum Predictive Model, and News Team. All these manipulate with agenda points, and these are very powerful cards. Of course, there are some weaker cards out there like Shikyu, but yeah, Notoriety is really strong because it's one of the few cards on the runner side that allows you to do this. In fact, I think it's the only one on the runner side. Moving on, you do not need to deal with defensive agendas. Now, this is a very huge benefit. This applies to both the RP and the food codes matchup, and actually a lot of matchups, because almost every deck runs NAPD, Global Food, or a combination of both. The fact that you don't need to prepare 4 credits to steal the NAPD or win that side game on the Future Perfect is huge. I don't need to say anything more about that. These all make it Notoriety a much more appealing option when people start playing defensive agendas and everyone realizes how powerful defensive agendas are nowadays. The problem with Notoriety is that it is far worse in the long run, because when you do the maths, even with the low agenda density of food codes, gaining 3 extra accesses of R&DI is already better than 1 agenda point on average. So if I get an early R&DI, it's better than Notoriety because I can repeatedly inside drop R&D for lots and lots of accesses. Well, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching Happy Net Running. Hope this was insightful. See you around.